Thank you very much, Stefano. And thank you for this very interesting meeting. I'm honored to be here. So I would like to start in the same place that Pope Francis starts, with the image, the figure of St. Francis. So he takes a medieval mendicant brother as a starting point for his reflections on fraternity for our day, our 21st century society. And I think this is worthy of further elaboration. I think we can look at the experience of living fraternity that comes out of that mendicant movement of which Francis was a part. I'm going to look specifically at the Dominicans because I know this better, and I'm sure there are people here who tell me, oh, but the Dominicans are different from the Franciscans. But I would say, in comparison to the 21st century society, the differences between the Franciscans and Dominicans are pretty minimal. They both come out of the same historical milieu. Dominicans refer to St. Francis as our Holy Father, and so on and so on. We can see lots of connections between them. And so the thing that interests me is how Pope Francis tried to take this model and then use it to inspire fraternity for today. So that's what I want to try and get deeper into. We have various references to fraternity throughout the encyclical. People have already mentioned them. I think there's three key points that are made in the moments where the Pope speaks with the most density about fraternity. First of all, that it makes freedom and equality really possible. We already heard other people comment on that. Secondly, when he's talking about universal fraternity, he says it must start with the recognition of dignity, but we will only arrive at the feast of universal fraternity when everyone is included. So we've got this sense of where it starts and where it's going to end. What's the goal that we want to get towards? We must start with recognition of dignity of everyone for universal fraternity, but we don't finish this process until everyone is included. And then only the third point, which comes right at the end of the encyclical, is his references, which are very strong, to how we need to have openness to the Father of all if we're going to have solid and stable reasons for fraternity. So we see there the religious element coming in. So I think we can see he's using a kind of rhetorical scheme here. He's trying to create the biggest space possible for everyone to participate in fraternity. But then at the end of the day, he doesn't pull his punches. He does say, we're not going to have a real solid foundation for fraternity unless we are open to an idea of God as Father, which may mean, for instance, one of the implications being here, that it's the believers in our society who help all of society to give a solid basis to fraternity. So anyway, we can talk about this. So as I said, if we're going to take this a bit further using Dominican tradition, I think the best way to do it is to try to answer a question. How do we live fraternally? Because we're thinking also about tradition that has 800 years of history. We're celebrating 800 years since the death of St. Dominic, and Stefano will know about that because there'll be big things going on in Bologna this year. So we've got some kind of long experience of how we actually live it. That's useful. Ideally, I would have liked to have the Dominicans on one side and the economy of Francesco on the other side. The Dominicans being long lasting and having some resilience, but obviously coming out of a very different culture from the one that we're in now. And the economy of Francisco being completely inserted into the 21st century experience. But of course, we don't know what's going to happen to it in the future. So that would be a nice comparison, but I only managed to do half of it so far. We might say, well, there's objections to doing this. You know, the Dominican Order isn't like the rest of society. It's based on God, and most of society isn't today. We have to have a sense of a calling to be part of a religious order, and you don't have a sense of calling or choose to join your society. And of course, religious orders have celibate members, and that makes them too different, people could say, from the rest of society. So I tried to deal with these objections. I don't want to go into that now. I think, though, we can say at the end of it, if you do look at that text, that the differences between an order like the Dominicans and the society as a whole, when you start getting into it, actually start to get a lot more complex and there's a lot more overlap than it might look at first sight. So I think that gives us some positive sense about going forward for this. So next, I'd just like to say something, kind of introduce the Dominican Order and its connection with this topic. Saint Dominic founded his community of brothers for preaching and the salvation of souls. That's in the fundamental constitution, it's still there. So I think the first thing we'd say is that God is the starting point for the foundation of the Dominicans, not the end point, as in Fratelli Tutti. But I would say we are dealing with two complementary ways of thinking about the role of belief in God in building fraternal relations. We might say we could see a complementarity, similar complementarity between the papacy of Benedict XVI and Francis. You know, Benedict XVI would put the religious element right in the front of it, whereas Francis is putting it at the end, but he's not missing it out. So I'd say there's two complementary positions there. I think another thing that's really important to emphasize in these introductory comments is the continual reference in the whole Dominican history to the members as brothers or as sisters, emphasizing their equality. And we can see this in the authority structures, for instance. Superiors are only elected. That's the basic tools. Everybody gets a voice in it. The superiors are called priors or prior provincials. In other words, they're kind of first among equals. No one's elected to a superior position for life. Superior is always changing. The superior is also, I think, another important thing to say here, a kind of figure of unity, which allows expression of difference, of tensions, of problems, arguments, things to be said quite strongly without threatening the underlying relationships, because the superior is a guarantee of unity. So it's actually a kind of safety valve as well, having that, not a sense of one person over another so much. There's other things I mentioned in the text. I'd like to draw out, though, a quote from a recent letter of one of the masters of the order, where he puts together the preaching mission. So what the order was founded for, with the building of fraternity and the role of superiors. So all these things, it's kind of summarizing what I've tried to say in this opening paragraph. He says, Dominic asked the first friars to promise him obedience for the common life. I think in this way, he was insisting upon the link between preaching and the work of fraternity. Quite important phrase, I think, work of fraternity. Implicitly affirming that the service of preaching is intimately linked to the mystery of the grace by which Christ establishes his church as fraternity. And then the church is given to the world as the sign of the hope of salvation. So we've got all these elements here. We've got the promise of obedience, setting up the possibility of common life. And then that common life is a kind of a work, building fraternity, which is part of preaching. And that sets the little cell, the work of fraternity, in the bigger community, which is church as fraternity. And then the church is given to the world as a sign of the hope of salvation. So I think this really summarizes in many ways how the Dominicans see themselves. And I want to emphasize just how important fraternal life is to the way Dominicans have thought about themselves and still think about themselves. So with that sort of background introduction, I'd make three main points trying to link fraternity in Fratelli Tutti, which is spoken to the 21st century, with what comes out of the Dominican tradition. First point is the role of faith in God in allowing us to develop a sense of a fraternal relation to others. So if we're thinking of living fraternity in the world to which Fratelli Tutti is addressed, the 21st century world, we might think about things like, do we need to face the problem created by secularization for building a sense of fraternity? And as a sort of partial answer to that, could we imagine a kind of interreligious platform for fraternity? Something that's more acceptable, maybe, to a secular society. Certainly, I think in UK today, people don't like particular religions, but if you have interreligious approach, that's much more acceptable. And we already have the basis for this in the imagery of St. Francis and the Sultan and the meeting between Pope Francis and the Imam. So that would be the first point. The second point would be the role of sensing a calling or vocation to a life of fraternity. So again, I think this could get us thinking in terms of our situation today. If we use the language of being called to be a part of society and recognize that calling in some symbolic way, could it help us build more fraternal relations between us? Now, I don't think we really think about that very much. We give children formation in citizenship or citizens education, that kind of thing, but they have to do it because they need to become good citizens, not because they have, in some sense, called to be a part of society. I don't think we emphasize that very much. And you know, Stefan is going to say in his paper, I know that we should make a distinction between brotherhood and fraternity. Brotherhood's just something you're born into. Fraternity is something you're called to. And I think this is quite important, this idea of being called to fraternity, not just being in a natural state of it. So somehow to recover that better is also, I think, interesting way we could build a connection between Dominicans and fraternity in the 21st century. And then the third point would be the role of the rule and constitutions in creating a framework for fraternity. And that opens a huge topic on something like, do we have the legal structures today that could permit the development of fraternal relations? I think this is really important, interesting topic. We could look at it in lots of ways. I just choose two here, using the constitutions of the friars, just focusing on their constitutions for the moment, as ways of fostering fraternity. First of all, we could talk about how the members have a voice, active, not all of them have passive, but anyway, active voice at least, in chapter, in the discussions, and in elections. And it's quite interesting if you look at the constitutions. I give you a little table about it in the little short summary. Nearly 50% more of the paragraphs in the constitutions are about government than they are about the life of the brothers. So I think that gives you some sense of where we are, how important this role of elections is in the life of the Dominicans. Nevertheless, the section on government only makes sense in the light of the life of the brothers. So the sections of the constitutions that deal with that come first. They are more crucial, even if they're shorter. And then, only then do we talk about law and government. And they only work because the brothers are trying to live a life of fraternal communion, however imperfectly they manage to do it. So I think that raises also the question, what's the relationship between society and law? How are we seeing this relationship? Do we actually have any sense of a relationship between these things that could allow fraternal relations to develop in our society? And then the second point coming out of the constitutions would be the way in which we deal with infractions, faults, sins, all those kinds of things, which is more in terms of possibility for fraternal correction, its patience, its support, recognizing frailty, these kinds of things, with the idea that building fraternal life is difficult. You know, the friars and the sisters are constantly struggling to live it. You know, the church might say that religious life is a state of perfection, but those of us who are in it know that it's not heaven on earth. You know, so
2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes, Helen.
So I think this sense of providing mechanisms for dealing with these difficulties so they don't undermine the whole project of trying to live fraternally, that's a very important element that comes out of the Constitution. So my last point to conclude is to say, we saw that the friars were founded for preaching. So they were founded for a particular mission. But the way of carrying out the mission involves putting effort into building fraternal communion. And from the earliest times, the convents and houses of the brothers were called the holy preaching. So the community life itself was seen as an integral part of the preaching mission. But if we compare the Dominicans to orders like Jesuits or Salesians or Opus Dei, we can see some of the drawbacks of the Dominican approach to carrying out their mission, because they're not so available, especially as individuals, to go out of the house. They have to stay mostly close to the centers of community life. So in some senses, they haven't been as effective, we might say, as the Jesuits have been. Building fraternal communion takes effort and work. It means less effort can be put into the external mission. But still, I would say the cost of this Dominican way of life, which requires investment in community life, as well as more classic external missionary preaching activity, may represent an interesting model for our society today, building fraternity in our society today, where there's great difficulty in work-life balance, as we talk about it, and where women often bear the burden of that. They're penalized in the workplace because they devote more time than men do often to the work of caring. And so as we try to move to more sustainable economies, where the work of caring will be more integrated into this, treated in a more integral, just and life-giving way, perhaps the contribution of the model of the Dominicans, brothers and sisters, which sees building fraternal communion as an integral part of their work, of their preaching mission, could be a contribution.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you. Thanks.